The fossil record bears testament to many odd-looking creatures, at least by modern standards anyway. Untold countless strange specimens would have slithered or bounded their way across the very same landscapes you unwittingly stroll upon. What with your lengthy vertebrae and fused jaws, you post-Mesozoic whippersnappers are merely newcomers. Of course, the adjective strange is a completely subjective term and can be equally liberally applied to organisms on either side of the Devonian towing line. An ancient sea-dwelling invertebrate, were it possessive of competent vision and rudimentary thought, could just as easily argue cats, dogs, and squirrels were hideously contorted abominations of ultra-progressive evolution. In many ways, the more seemingly strange creatures of eons gone by were no weirder than the more established tetrapoidal creatures of the modern day. You could argue that the dearth inviability of these earlier life forms was simply due to the fickle undulations of the fingers of fortune. From time to time, it loosens its grip and lets the wildly thrashing gales of chaos unfurl themselves amongst its clutches. The now defunct missing branches of the Tree of Life were just unfortunate enough to have been let slip completely, and were swallowed up by the great chasm of entropy. If they weren't subjected to unfavorable fleeting circumstances when they happened to have been, many could have easily survived and prospered amongst the ranks of the still breathing. A great example of one of these sudden unfair circumstances was shouldered by our own species. The Toba eruption was a cataclysmic and relatively rare event that happened to have struck at a point when humanity was somewhat scarce and not as wide-ranging as they are today. It crippled Paleolithic peoples and reduced their numbers to a frighteningly low quantity. Were this eruption slightly more devastating, or were the survivors not so hardy as they were, it could have easily spelled the end of the story of mankind. Many other species were not quite so lucky and met their end in a similarly unpredictable fashion. Well, you can forget about all of that, because the species I'm going to tell you about died out due to an inability to adapt quickly enough to a steadily shifting climate, despite having plenty of time to do so. In other words, it was a bit of a shoddily designed specimen. And I do use the word designed metaphorically here. Introducing Arthropleura, a myriapod that lived between 290 and 350 million years ago. A myriapod is simply a member of the phylum Arthropoda who possesses a few too many feet. The term myriapod literally translating to countless foot. Many species of modern millipede and centipede find themselves among the myriapods. Arthropleura inhabited much of what is now Europe and North America, although during this time in Earth's history they would have looked a little less recognizable to us, as many of the landmasses of Earth were on their way to forming the supercontinent of Pangaea. The fossil record was also testament to a great number of many-legged arthropods that preceded Arthropleura, so that isn't necessarily what made it strange. What did set Arthropleura apart from most of its ilk was its sheer gargantuan size. Far eclipsing in heft and dimension what any land-dwelling arthropod today could boast, Arthropleura was positively unbelievable to its discoverers. An arthropod of its size was certainly something to behold for a 19th century paleontologist. Measuring between 2 to 2.5 meters, it would have dwelled in highly forested areas and sheltered close to water, with some researchers believing it to have had an amphibious life cycle. Its discovery in western central Germany was no surprise then, being perfectly representative of its preferred habitat even in the Carboniferous period. One seminal researcher by the name of Gerard Waterlot posited that Arthropleura may have spent a majority of its time underwater, and only would occasionally skitter to the surface to intake humid swamp air through its primitive gill slits. You can completely disregard the little speech I made earlier about the subjectivity of strangeness. An underwater swamp-dwelling taxi-sized amphibious millipede is pretty damn strange. And if only to exaggerate its strangeness, an adult specimen of Arthropleura may have weighed as much as a jaguar, that's the cat not the car, and may have been equally as carnivorous as one, with researchers remarking that its diet would have largely consisted of other creatures. Arthropleurus would have subsisted on smaller scurrying organisms in its habitat. Although the diet and indeed much of the lifestyle of Arthropleura is still in contention, as some researchers argue that its diet was probably more varied and incorporated both plant and animal matter. Plus, its large size and densely packed legs would have suggested that Arthropleura was a slow-moving organism. A shiny scuttling bug the size of a legless cow with no camouflage to speak of sluggishly inching its way along may not have made for the most covert predator. Initially, the evolution of arthropod millipedes to the sizes demonstrated by specimens such as those of Arthropleura was attributed to elevated oxygen levels of the Carboniferous. This was held as the generally accepted mainstream sentiment for quite a while, but subsequent discoveries showed that Arthropleura attained its large size prior to the spike in oxygen levels. In fact, the largest presently known fossil of Arthropleura actually dates to a period where the oxygen saturation of the atmosphere was similar to today's levels. A fact I'm sure will help arachnophobes and other creepy-crawly haters the world over sleep soundly. Instead, the likely reason Arthropleura was allowed to balloon up to the size it did was simply that of opportunity. A phenomenon which has been observed in many species is a gradual increase in size permitted by scavenging opportunities and the lack of competition. The entelodont is a good example of this. Gradual growth over time allows an organism to more effectively outcompete and muscle out its competition, whilst also generally allowing for the occupation of a larger amount of territory by a single individual, until eventually the surrounding environment reaches the limit of its capacity to support a population of creatures of such size in a single niche. Over time, conditions change, and the large, highly specialized species is quite likely to be outcompeted or to simply go extinct due to an inability to adapt. Arthropleura may have grew as large as it did simply because a comparative lack of competition and an abundance of provisions allowed it to. However, as mentioned earlier, the tale of Arthropleura's demise may have been as steady and painful as its formative growth spurts. The area which it inhabited began to become subject to gradual desertification, or desertification if you like, with the atmospheric humidity decreasing and a drop in the prevalence of lush fertile land, the encroaching aridity, having once been relegated to small clusters of barren lifelessness, now spread far and wide, threatening the livelihood and habitat of Arthropleura. This desertification did not subside and may have actually slightly intensified over time. In the opulence and fecundity of the areas it had inhabited, Arthropleura had likely managed to saturate the entirety of its niche due to its enormity. The shift in environmental conditions would have pushed things past the tipping point, and Arthropleura would eventually succumb to a lack of feeding opportunities and moist, humid environments to support itself. Its size, owing to its high specialization for its specific niche, would have been both a literal and metaphorical encumbrance as it failed to adapt quickly enough, eventually causing Arthropleura to die out completely.